My name is Eleanor Hayes, and until the day my grandfather died, almost no one outside our small circle knew I existed. Not the media, not Wall Street, not even some distant cousins who suddenly remembered my name once the headlines came out. I was always the quiet one, the overlooked granddaughter, the one who didn't chase fame, money, or attention. I had learned early on that my family cared more about appearances than actual relationships. My grandfather, Richard Hayes, was a man whose name carried weight in every corner of Chicago and far beyond. Billionaire, industrialist, shrewd investor, he was someone who could make or break companies with a single call. Most people thought he was cold, distant, impossible to reach. And in a way, he was. But to me, he was Grandpa Richard, the man who let me raid his pantry for midnight snacks, who asked me silly questions about my day just to hear my voice, and who, despite his wealth, treated me like a real person. My parents, on the other hand, were nothing like him. They had grown up on his money, the glamour of social events, and the unspoken power that came with the Hayes name. They were always chasing something bigger houses, bigger donations, bigger status, symbols, yet somehow never found the time to really be with their own family. I had grown up watching them navigate life like chess pieces, always thinking 2 steps ahead for wealth or influence, but never stopping to care about me. I knew their love had limits, mostly financial ones. I, however, had something different. I had time with Grandpa Richard. I had stories, secrets, and lessons hidden in the folds of his study. I would spend hours there, sitting on the worn leather chair while he explained the history behind his companies, the ethics of business, and sometimes, more importantly, the importance of family, real family, not just blood ties or legal papers. In his presence, I felt seen. I felt capable. I felt like someone who mattered, not someone who existed only to be a prop in a public image. It was a crisp autumn morning when everything changed. I remember walking into his house and noticing the silence. It was heavier than usual. The staff were unusually tense. There were whispers, and my heart sank before I even saw him. Grandpa Richard was lying in his study, pale but composed. He looked at me with a faint smile, the kind that had always carried reassurance. "Eleanor," he said, his voice weak but steady, "I have something important to tell you. I trust you with this." I nodded, unsure what it could be. I had always assumed the family fortune would pass through the line of my parents, as it had always been rumored. I thought I might inherit something small, maybe a house, a token investment, but never did I imagine what was coming. Over the next few days, I watched him carefully, learning every little detail he was willing to share, every word carefully chosen, every story that painted a picture of how he truly valued loyalty, compassion, and intelligence over entitlement. And when the end finally came, when his breathing slowed and his eyes closed for the last time, I felt a mix of grief and something else, a quiet anticipation, a sense of responsibility that settled heavily on my shoulders. I knew the world outside would never see him as I did. They would see a billionaire passing away and imagine his empire being contested, fought over like a prize. But I also knew that I had earned his trust in ways my parents never had. And deep down, I suspected that he had a plan, a way to reward the one person who had truly been there, who had never asked for anything in return, who had understood him when no one else could. I didn't know it yet, but my life was about to change forever. And the people I thought I could rely on, the ones who had given me my very existence, would soon show their true colors. Because love, loyalty, and money rarely mix in families like mine. And when billions are at stake, the line between family and foe becomes terrifyingly thin. The day of my grandfather's will reading felt surreal, like I had stepped into someone else's life. The air in the grand conference room was heavy, a mixture of polished oak, expensive leather, and tension so thick you could almost touch it. I sat at the far end of the long table, trying to make myself small, hoping nobody would notice me, hoping, somehow, that I could just fade into the shadows like I usually did. Of course, I couldn't, not that day. Lawyers filed in, everyone straightening their suits, adjusting ties, and taking their seats with all the seriousness of a boardroom summit. I recognized some faces from the family's legal team, a few from my grandfather's companies, and a handful of distant relatives I barely knew. They all had one thing in common. They thought the money was theirs by right. They assumed I was nothing, just a girl who occasionally visited her grandfather and ate his snacks. Then, the attorney, Mr. Langford, a man so stern he could make marble look soft, cleared his throat. The room hushed. He opened the thick leather-bound book in front of him, and suddenly my world shifted. "My first item," he began, "is the allocation of the Hayes family estate. And I want to start with the grandchild who was present and closest to Mr. Hayes during his final years, Eleanor Hayes." I froze. I could feel the weight of every eye in the room on me, but I didn't look up. My stomach churned. Did he just say my name? "Yes," Mr. Langford continued. "Eleanor Hayes shall inherit the entirety of Mr. Richard Hayes' estate." including all trusts, assets, real estate, and shares in controlling companies. The total value as estimated is $7 billion. $7 billion. The words echoed in my head, bouncing between disbelief and fear. My hands went cold. My mind raced. 7 billion. That number didn't even make sense. I had never handled that kind of money in my life. I had barely handled a personal bank account, and yet, just like that, my grandfather had entrusted me with it. The room went silent. Then came the chaos. My mother's face went pale, a mixture of shock and anger twisting her features. I could see her lips tremble as she whispered to my father, who had leaned back in his chair, initially looking amused. But then the amusement faded. Slowly, like a curtain dropping, he realized that this was no joke. The fortune, the empire, everything he had expected to inherit, was slipping through his fingers. The attorney continued almost mechanically, detailing the rest of the will. My parents would receive nominal, some symbolic gestures. Distant relatives got token bequests. But the majority of the wealth, the controlling shares, the trusts, were all mine. I felt my throat tighten, my hands trembling. Not because I wanted it, but because I knew what this would trigger. My parents, who had spent my whole life teaching me that love could be bought, now looked at me as if I had committed the ultimate betrayal. I had never asked for a dime. I had never sought attention, nor had I tried to manipulate my grandfather. Yet now, in that room, my loyalty and presence had been rewarded, and they saw it as an injustice. My mother gasped, her voice cracking. This isn't fair. Eleanor, you can't do this to us. You're our daughter. I swallowed, keeping my voice calm. Grandpa made his choice. I won't change it. My father stood, fists clenched at the edge of the table. We built this family. We earned this. You don't understand what you're taking from us. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't feel afraid. I felt steady. I had been underestimated my whole life. Now, everyone was learning a lesson they wouldn't forget. The rest of the day passed in a blur of whispered arguments, sharp glares, and legal advisors scribbling notes. I barely heard it all. All I could think about was my grandfather, his smile, his quiet lessons, the way he had trusted me when no one else had, and deep down, I knew this was only the beginning, because money might have changed hands in an instant, but families are complicated. And greed, I would soon learn, could be much more dangerous than I ever imagined. The next morning, my parents didn't wait to speak. They stormed into my room like a hurricane I hadn't seen coming. I was sitting at my desk staring at the stack of documents Grandpa's lawyer had handed me, still trying to process everything when my mother's voice pierced the quiet. Eleanor, you can't possibly accept this. You can't. Her face was pale, but her eyes blazed with a mixture of anger and desperation. She clutched a silk scarf around her neck like a shield, but the tremor in her hands betrayed her. My father, standing behind her, looked calm too. Calm, but his jaw was tight, and I could see the rage simmering just below the surface. You don't understand, my mother continued, her voice shaking. We raised you. We fed you. We gave you everything. I swallowed. I wanted to scream, to throw things, to make her understand that raising me had never been the same as loving me, but I didn't. Instead, I looked her in the eyes and said something I had rehearsed silently for weeks. Grandpa made his choice. I respect it. I can't change it. For a second, they froze. The words hung in the air like an invisible barrier. My mother's lips trembled. My father's fists clenched at his sides. You're just a child. You don't know what you're doing. My father spat. This money isn't just numbers, it's power. It's the family legacy. You're throwing it away. I laughed softly, bitterly, and it wasn't a sound I recognized as my own. Throwing it away? I asked. I'm not throwing anything away. I'm protecting it. Protecting it from people who think love can be bought. Protecting it from people who care more about status than family. My mother gasped. Eleanor, how can you say that? How dare you speak to us like this? Because I'm tired of being told I owe you everything, I said, my voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. I never asked for this money. I never manipulated Grandpa. He trusted me because I was there. You weren't. You left. You ignored him until the headlines mattered. And now you act like I stole from you. My father's face turned red. This is not just about Grandpa. This is about us. You are betraying your family. Don't think this ends here, Eleanor. We will fight. You will regret this. I stood up, walking toward him, not out of fear, but out of certainty. No, I said, you are the ones who will regret this. Because this isn't about revenge. This is about respect. You taught me that money equals power, but Grandpa taught me that power without integrity is meaningless. I know who I am, and I know who I want to be. I'm not becoming you. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then my mother broke it, her voice a trembling mix of anger and hurt. You're not just ungrateful. You're cruel. You're turning your back on your family. I shook my head slowly. I'm not turning my back. I'm standing up. And for the first time in my life, I'm standing for myself. My father stepped closer, threatening, but I didn't flinch. I had spent years being small, being invisible, and it had never protected me. Now, I realized that the only thing that would protect me was the truth and my grandfather's wisdom, which had been passed to me in silence, in small lessons. In moments when no one else was paying attention, the rest of the day was a blur of shouted arguments, slammed doors, and whispered threats. They tried every tactic: guilt, manipulation, emotional blackmail, but I refused to respond in kind. I refused to let them control me, even though every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, because I had learned something important in those quiet evenings with Grandpa. Power is not just in money, it's in patience, in strategy, in knowing when to fight and when to let the world show someone's true colors. By the time they left that night, my parents weren't just angry, they were humiliated. And I knew deep down this was only the beginning, because once greed has been awakened, it doesn't sleep. And I was about to learn just how far people will go when they think they're entitled to something that was never theirs. The next few weeks were a nightmare. I couldn't wake up from. My parents didn't take no for an answer. Instead, they escalated everything. It wasn't enough to yell, cry, or plead. They wanted to destroy me. It started with lawyers. Overnight, our peaceful family drama became a war zone of attorneys, subpoenas, and legal documents I barely understood. My inbox overflowed with letters from law firms claiming undue influence, fraud, mental incapacity, name it. Each page made my stomach twist. Every time I opened an envelope, I felt like I was stepping deeper into a trap I couldn't escape. And then came the media. I woke up one morning to headlines that made my chest tighten. Ungrateful, heiress steals family fortune. Teen billionaire sparks family feud, parents left penniless. Money over morality. Granddaughter inherits, family outraged. I couldn't believe it. Complete strangers were judging me. People I had never met who knew nothing about my life or the love I had shared with my grandfather were calling me greedy, selfish, and ungrateful. My phone buzzed nonstop with anonymous messages, some angry and some downright threatening. But here's the thing. I didn't break. I had Grandpa Richard's teachings in my head. I remembered every quiet evening, every conversation in his study. I remembered how he had carefully prepared for this moment, knowing my parents would try to take what wasn't theirs. I remembered the trust he had placed in me and the wisdom he had quietly given. Eleanor, always let the truth be louder than anger. And the truth, as I knew it, was on my side. Grandpa had left detailed trusts, legal protections, and even recorded messages that explained exactly why the estate had been left to me. Every lawyer who came at me legally was met with airtight documents. Every accusation could be countered with facts. And every media story that painted me as greedy was easily disproven, but only if I stayed calm, strategic, and unafraid. Meanwhile, my parents were panicking. Their lawyers pushed for every loophole, every scandal they could fabricate. And the media. They ate it up. Suddenly, my parents were everywhere. Tabloids, social media, late-night talk shows. They were portrayed as the victims, and I was the villain. I could feel the public's judgment pressing down on me like a storm cloud, but I refused to let it touch me. I started documenting everything myself. Letters, phone calls, even text messages from my parents demanding I hand over money. I kept a journal detailing every interaction, every threat, every manipulation. It wasn't just for MIT, it was for the court, for anyone who needed proof that I was standing on solid ground, and it worked. Slowly, cracks began to appear. Law firms realized they were dealing with someone who was prepared. The media began to notice inconsistencies in the narrative my parents were spinning, and for the first time I sensed a shift in power. I also started to notice something else: my parents' desperation. They were angry, yes, but beneath the surface, they were terrified. They had assumed the estate was theirs by right. They had assumed that money could be demanded, taken, manipulated, but the closer they came to understanding the legal protections Grandpa had left, the more powerless they became. And I watched it all quietly, knowing that patience, not rage, would be my most powerful weapon by the end of the month. The lawsuits had been filed, the media storm had begun, and my parents had lost any semblance of control over the narrative. But I was ready. I had my grandfather's wisdom, my own resolve, and a growing understanding that winning this battle wasn't about anger. It was about strategy, and I was just getting started. Because when greed meets patience, one side always loses. And I wasn't going to be the one to lose. It was during one of the most tense days of the legal battle that the full brilliance of my grandfather revealed itself. My parents' lawyers had been relentless, throwing every claim they could imagine at me: accusations of manipulation, claims that I was too young to handle the inheritance, insinuations that Grandpa had been coerced. The courtroom felt like a battlefield, and I felt small, like a single soldier against a professional army. But then, the judge allowed something extraordinary. A recording I remember feeling my stomach flip the moment the tape started. It was my grandfather's voice, calm, deliberate, unflinching. He spoke directly to the camera, explaining the reasoning behind every decision in his will. He talked about the businesses, the trusts, the billions he had built, and why he had chosen me to inherit them. He also addressed my parents by name, detailing with astonishing clarity their patterns of greed, neglect, and disinterest in what truly mattered: family, integrity, and loyalty. "Eleanor," he said, his voice soft but commanding, "I trust you because you stayed when others left. You listened when others ignored. You loved without conditions, and that love deserves protection." I felt tears welling up, but I held them back. My parents' faces were frozen in horror. They had expected a legal battle, maybe some minor resistance, but not this. Not a grandfather who had planned for every contingency, every possible attack, every lie. It wasn't just the recording. The legal safeguards my grandfather had put in place were astonishing. Multiple trusts, each layered and independent, ensured that I had complete control over the estate. Each asset had conditions, clauses, and restrictions that prevented anyone, especially my parents, from taking over. He had even anticipated lawsuits like this, including clauses that protected the inheritance from frivolous legal challenges. Every time my parents' lawyers tried to argue undue influence, mental incapacity, or manipulation, I had evidence prepared: emails, letters, personal notes from my grandfather, detailed accountings, all meticulously documented. It was like walking into a courtroom where the truth wasn't just on your side, it was armed and unshakable. Watching my parents' reactions was surreal. My mother covered her face with her hands, her sobs audible but meaningless in the face of the evidence. My father, usually so composed and intimidating, couldn't find words. His lawyers were scrambling, flipping through papers, muttering under their breath, realizing that every attack they had planned was falling apart. The recording ended, but the impact lingered. The courtroom had shifted. Witnesses who had been ready to testify against me paused, realizing the truth was undeniable. Even the judge, who had remained neutral throughout, gave a subtle nod, acknowledging the clarity and foresight in my grandfather's arrangements, and for the first time, I felt a strange sense of calm. I realized that this was exactly how Grandpa had intended it to play out. He had prepared me for battle, armed me with knowledge, and made sure that no amount of greed could touch what he had trusted me with. I looked at my parents across the courtroom, their faces pale, eyes wide with disbelief. The power they had assumed was theirs had evaporated. The empire they thought they could claim with entitlement was untouchable because it had never been theirs. I didn't gloat, I didn't mock, I didn't even look away. I simply sat, letting the truth speak louder than any argument they could make. And in that silence I felt a strange satisfaction, not revenge, not triumph, but clarity. For the first time, I realized the magnitude of what my grandfather had given me: not just billions of dollars, but the wisdom to navigate a world where greed and love often collide, where family can betray, and where patience and foresight can protect what truly matters. And I knew in my heart that this was just the beginning of showing my parents and the world that power isn't in wealth alone. True power lies in integrity, strategy, and staying true to yourself. After the recording was revealed in court, and the legal safeguards of my grandfather's will were laid bare, something remarkable happened. The dynamic shifted, not immediately, but subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. My parents were no longer attacking me with confidence. They were floundering. Their fury, once sharp and directed, began to crumble into desperation. I realized then that the greatest weapon wasn't anger, wasn't shouting, wasn't even the courtroom theatrics. It was patience and silence. I stopped reacting to their calls and messages. I didn't argue. I didn't beg or negotiate. Every demand for money, every tearful threat, every attempt to manipulate me was met with calm, calculated restraint. I had learned from Grandpa Richard that losing your cool was losing control, and I wasn't about to give them the satisfaction. The public, meanwhile, was slowly beginning to notice the cracks in the story my parents were spinning. Journalists, who had initially painted me as the villain, began digging deeper, uncovering inconsistencies in their claims. Old business records, public filings, and even past interviews revealed a pattern. My parents had often exploited family wealth for their own gain, while maintaining a polished public image. The narrative was turning subtly, silently in my favor. But I didn't celebrate. I didn't even acknowledge the shift publicly. I was strategic, letting the world see my parents' desperation while keeping my own dignity intact. Every leak they made, every story they planted, every attorney they hired to attack me legally, only served to expose them further. And I had the evidence to counter every single claim. Emails, spies told, correspondences where my parents had pressured my grandfather for business decisions and financial control. Documents revealed past settlements they had quietly negotiated, diverting money in ways that weren't exactly ethical. Every attempt to claim moral superiority crumbled under the weight of truth. And all the while, I stayed quiet. I let the facts speak. It was during one court session, when the judge allowed evidence of financial manipulation by my parents, that I realized something extraordinary. The tables had completely turned. My parents had expected to intimidate me with lawsuits, media stories, and emotional appeals. Instead, they were cornered, exposed, powerless to stop the tide they had unleashed. I could see it in their eyes. Fear, disbelief, and a bitter realization. All their schemes, all their entitlement, all their plans to take the inheritance had failed. And they were beginning to understand that no amount of money or influence could undo what my grandfather had carefully orchestrated. It wasn't revenge in the traditional sense. I didn't hack their accounts. I didn't humiliate them in public. I didn't even confront them outside of court. My revenge was the quiet kind, the kind that comes from watching truth. Law and patience do the work for you. By the end of the month, my parents' public image was tarnished. The tabloids that once accused me of greed were now running stories, exposing financial mismanagement, entitlement, and manipulations by my parents. Friends, business associates, and social circles that once seemed loyal to them began to distance themselves. And I remained steadfast, untouched, and, most importantly, free. For the first time, I understood a lesson Grandpa had tried to teach me repeatedly. Power isn't in taking action for immediate gratification, it's in planning, patience, and letting circumstances reveal the truth. My parents had assumed that attacking me would intimidate or scare me into compliance. They had assumed I was a naive girl who didn't understand money, influence, or the game of power. But I wasn't. I had stayed. I had watched. I had learned. And now, without even lifting a hand, the world was beginning to see me as Grandpa had always known I would be: capable, intelligent, and unyielding. And while my parents were frantically trying to claw back control they never had, I finally felt something I had never experienced before. Calm, quiet satisfaction. I wasn't angry. I wasn't vengeful. I was simply prepared for whatever came next, and I knew that when it did, I would be ready, because greed may give people temporary power, but integrity and strategy, well, that lasts forever. The day of the final hearing arrived with a heavy weight I could almost feel in my chest. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Reporters jostled for space, cameras flashed, and every seat was filled with spectators who had been following this family drama for months. But I didn't feel nervous. I felt steady, focused. I had Grandpa's wisdom, the truth on my side, and the knowledge that patience had already turned the tide in my favor. My parents, on the other hand, looked like shadows of their former selves. My mother's makeup was smudged from days of stress, her lips pressed tightly together as if she were trying to hold in words that had no meaning anymore. My father, always composed, had a hard edge in his eyes that suggested anger, disbelief, and fear all at once. Their lawyers shuffled papers nervously, muttering to each other, clearly aware that every argument they had planned was failing before it even began. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. The hearing began formally, but it felt almost ceremonial. It was clear to everyone in that room that this wasn't going to be a fight of skill or rhetoric, it was going to be a reckoning. The first piece of evidence presented was the recording of my grandfather. Again, the courtroom listened as his voice explained, in meticulous detail, why the estate had been left to me and not my parents. His words were calm, deliberate, and final. Every argument about undue influence, fraud, or incapacity crumbled under the weight of his logic. Then came the documentation of my grandfather's trusts, the legal safeguards that had been meticulously planned to protect the estate. Each document, clause, and condition was laid out clearly, showing that I was not just entitled to the inheritance, I was protected from any external interference. No matter how desperate or determined, the final blow, though, came from the evidence of my parents' financial mismanagement and past manipulations. Emails, contracts, and accounting records revealed patterns of behavior that were impossible to ignore. The courtroom, the media, and even my parents' own lawyers could see it. Their greed, entitlement, and manipulations had been laid bare. I watched my parents slowly realize what was happening. Their eyes darted nervously between the documents, the judge, and me. My mother's hands trembled as she clutched her purse. My father's jaw tightened as if he were trying to physically hold back the collapse he could no longer prevent. Finally, the judge spoke. After reviewing all evidence, it is clear that the claims against Eleanor Hayes are without merit. The court finds in favor of Eleanor Hayes, affirming her complete and uncontested inheritance of her grandfather's estate. Furthermore, the plaintiffs are ordered to cover all legal costs incurred. I felt a strange mixture of relief and calm satisfaction wash over me. The courtroom erupted into whispers, gasps, and camera flashes, but I barely noticed. I wasn't celebrating. I was simply free. My parents didn't speak. They didn't even make eye contact with me. For the first time, they were powerless, stripped of every argument, every claim, every attempt to take what was never theirs. Their world of entitlement, carefully built over decades, had crumbled under the simple, unshakable truth. Outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed me. Questions fired at me like bullets, but I kept my answers simple, measured, and dignified. I didn't need to gloat. The truth had already spoken. Meanwhile, my parents' reputations, once polished and untouchable, lay in ruins. Business partners withdrew. Boards demanded resignations. Social circles that had once revered them now whispered about their greed and manipulation. They had lost far more than money. They had lost credibility, influence, and control. And I realized something important. This was never about revenge. I hadn't set out to humiliate them or destroy their lives. I had simply stayed true to myself, honored my grandfather's wishes, and let the truth unfold. In the end, that was far more powerful than any act of retaliation. I walked out of the courtroom that day, not victorious in the sense of conquest, but victorious in freedom. The weight of fear, doubt, and manipulation that had hovered over me for months lifted. I finally understood my grandfather's greatest lesson. Real power isn't measured in wealth alone. It's measured in integrity, patience, and the courage to stand firm when everyone else doubts you. And my parents, they were left with the consequences of their choices. After the courtroom battle was over, the world seemed to pause for a moment. I walked out of that imposing building in Chicago with my head held high. Not because I had won billions, but because I had survived. I had stayed true to myself, honored my grandfather's wisdom, and navigated a storm that could have broken anyone else. My parents didn't speak to me after that day. My mother sent a brief, cold letter apologizing for the pain caused, though it felt hollow. My father, he avoided my gaze entirely, as if pretending I didn't exist would somehow undo what had happened. But I didn't need their acknowledgement. I didn't need their approval. The truth and the future was firmly in my hands. I had inherited more than money. I had inherited responsibility. $7 billion wasn't just a number, it was a tool. A chance to honor the legacy of a man who had taught me more in quiet evenings than most people learn in a lifetime. And I intended to use it wisely. I started small in ways that mattered. I funded scholarships for students from underprivileged communities, the kind of kids who reminded me of my own struggles growing up. I invested in ethical businesses that prioritized people over profits, creating jobs and opportunities for those who had been overlooked. I restored properties my grandfather had loved, not as monuments to wealth, but as spaces where communities could thrive. Every decision I made carried a piece of him, and a piece of the values he had instilled in me: integrity, responsibility, and compassion. And the best part? I didn't have to prove anything to anyone. Not to the media, not to my parents, not to society. The victories, the change, the impact, it was all real, tangible, and lasting. Sometimes people ask me if I ever feel guilty for refusing to share my inheritance with my parents. They ask if I ever wonder whether I should have kept the peace. And I always smile gently. No, I don't. Because what I gave up was nothing compared to what they had lost. Their greed, entitlement, and disregard for true family had already cost them far more than money. They lost respect, credibility, and the chance to leave a legacy of their own making. Meanwhile, I gained far more than wealth. I gained freedom, purpose, and the ability to honor a man who had truly loved me. Even now, years later, I feel the lessons of those months every day. I remember sitting in that courtroom watching my parents' frustration and disbelief unfold, and realizing that revenge wasn't necessary. Real power doesn't come from paying someone back, it comes from living well, with integrity and purpose, and letting truth and justice take care of the rest. I also learned the value of patience. So many people would have reacted with anger, with impulsive retaliation, or with spite. But patience allowed me to see the bigger picture, to let evidence and integrity do what emotion alone never could. My grandfather had taught me that patience wasn't passive, it was active, strategic, and transformative. Now, when I walk through the offices of businesses I've invested in, or see the smiles of students receiving scholarships in my name, or hear the laughter of workers thriving in communities once neglected, I know I am honoring him. I am carrying forward the best parts of him, and making sure his vision and his wisdom endures far beyond his lifetime. And as for my parents, they are still living their lives, but in a different world, one where their actions had consequences, one where greed and entitlement no longer hold sway, and I have nothing but peace, because the greatest revenge, I realized, isn't punishment. It's success, dignity, and the courage to remain true to yourself when everyone else doubts you. It's knowing that your actions create ripples that last far longer than anger ever could. I didn't just inherit $7 billion. I inherited a legacy, and I'm determined to honor it every single day.